and thank you for joining us for Trust Building in the Black Community, Trust in Untrusting Times. Good evening, I am Dr. Carrie Register Haley, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. This is the second in a three-part series that we are having a virtual discussion with the community, which is intended to shift the narrative around mistrust while exploring relationships of trust in the Black community with various systems. We will take this time to dig deep into a conversation about how our attitudes, our beliefs, and our behaviors impact our decision-making process when it comes to things like mental health, medical health, public safety, government, child welfare, and the legal system. Our virtual event tonight will be focusing on youth mental health, child welfare, education, and the juvenile system. But before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, this session is being recorded. So if you don't want your name to show up or you want to remove some personally identifying things, take the opportunity to do so now. You can be in the session with your camera on or off. It is your option. And for those who are new to Zoom, there are two different features that you can utilize in this session. It's either the speaker view or you can have it on gallery. And if you just go up to the right-hand corner and you can click on the speaker view and you will only be able to see the person speaking currently, or you can shift it to the gallery view so that you can see everybody who is in our virtual environment. Also, we have closed captioning available for those who need it. If you have an issue or concern about using closed captioning, just type that into the chat box and we will get you to the right person so that you can get some assistance. Now, as you notice, when you entered the room, everybody was put on mute. That was designed that way so that we can keep down the noise and so that we can actually constantly engage one another in this session. We have multiple team members that are available. So if you put a question in the chat box, that question, I will make sure that it gets to the panel. If we have enough time available, I will also open up the virtual floor for you to ask questions directly. Now, keep in mind that whatever you put into the chat box, please make sure that it's on topic and be mindful of the audience that we have here, that it's appropriate. Throughout this evening, we will be using the polling feature. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's the polls down there. You see it right next to your chat box. Once we post the poll question, it'll pop up on the screen and then you'll have some choices. We encourage everybody to utilize the polls, to please respond to the polls. And it's anonymous, so it won't be tied to anyone, so your information will be safe. Now, for those who cannot see the polling question, I will be reading it out loud and also the options that you can choose. And if you want to, you can throw your answer into the chat box. And even if you do use the polling feature and you have a comment or you have a follow-up observation, you can throw that into the chat box as well. And finally, at the end of this session, we will have a lot of resources available for you, but don't worry, if you don't catch the resources, you will get them anyways, because we will be sending out a survey after this session is over. And within the survey, you will also have the link for the resources. We are asking you to please make sure that you take just 5 minutes out of your time to complete the survey, because it helps us with the third session, but also gives us some great feedback on what else do we need to be looking at when it comes to trust and building trust in the Black community. Now that I've gotten the housekeeping out of the way, let me introduce myself formally. My name is Dr. Carrie Register Haley. I am currently the Health Committee Chair for the Northern Virginia chapter of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. And I will be your moderator for the duration of this evening. Now, joining me is Mr. D'Angelo Taylor, who is mental health counselor and wellness coach, founder of Soundtrack to Life, wraparound facilitator, Fairfax Falls Church Community Service Board. We also have Ms. Keyshawn Scalsborough, who is the Family Support Partner Supervisor, National Alliance on Mental Illness, Northern Virginia. And we have Ms. Leona Smith Vance, who is the Director of Equity and Family Engagement, Office of Professional Learning and Family Engagement, Fairfax County Public Schools. And the newly retired, only 4 days under her retirement belt, Ms. Emma Marshall, who was the Foster Care and Adoption Support and Resources, Fairfax County Department of Family Services. And lastly, we have Mr. Solomon Melson, who is the Operations Manager, Region 1, Fairfax County Department of Neighborhood and Community Services. Now, with that being said, we're getting ready to dive deep. And I'm going to say this one time and one time only, so please remember it. The only bad question is the question not answered, or the question not asked. So please make sure that you throw all your questions in the chat box and your observations so we can dig deep tonight. And we're going to kick this off by starting with Mr. D'Angelo Taylor, and we're going to ask each one of our panel members to answer two questions. Number one, what is your purpose? What motivates you to do this work? And then second, what's your definition of trust? Please take 1 to 3 minutes each, and we'll start off with Mr. Taylor, and open up your mic and go ahead and answer the question, please.
So I want to thank you for allowing me to go ahead and speak, and thank you all and everyone who's out there right now that's viewing. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is D'Angelo Taylor, licensed professional counselor, also a wraparound facilitator with Fairfax County. The reason I do what I even do what I'm doing is I recognize the stigma that we have within the Black community as it relates to mental health, and how difficult it can be for many of us to even discuss those issues that's going on internally, with our family and those around us. So being a person who is able to get people to engage and respond, but also approach mental health through a culturally responsive lens, I think that's very important. Being able to connect with clients in that way is something that being able to break down those barriers that's preventing them to be able to access healthcare, be able to really recognize what it is that's going on and address those issues. I feel that that's very important. My definition of trust is having strong confidence in people, or having strong confidence that something will get done, or being able to rely on someone or something without them falling short. So
thank you very much for that, D'Angelo. And so next we are going to go to Ms. Keishana. Keishana, can you go ahead and give us your why and then your definition of trust?
Well, my why is, first of all, I'm a family support partner with NAMI Northern Virginia. And a family support partner is a parent who has navigated the mental health system due to their child that they're caring for. Actually, they don't even have to necessarily be the biological parent, but they're caring for a child that has a mental health condition, developmental disability, or intellectual disability. And they've navigated those systems and been able to get to a resilient place to be able to support other parents that are going through that as well now. And the reason why I chose to do that was because I have a 22-year-old daughter. She's 22 now, but at the age of 12, she started to show different behaviors that I had never seen before. And she now has a diagnosis of bipolar 1. And the challenges I went through her, I felt alone, and no one that I could talk to. I had lack of natural supports, meaning my family, my sister, my mom, my cousins, my friends. And so a family support partner, again, is someone that can fill some of those areas, support that parent again. And my definition of trust is, I would ditto what D'Angelo said, reliability. That's what I see in the definition of trust.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ms. Leona.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Leona Smith Vance, representing Fairfax County Public Schools. And I get the honor of having a really great title, but really it's more than a title, the title of Director of Equity and Family Engagement. And so my why is around this idea of equity. When I think about equity, I think about three things. I think about opportunity, support, and expectations. And what I really think about is that there are times even in my own life where I was afforded those three things, especially from my own parents. My mom was a migrant worker from Mexico. My dad dropped out of high school as an African-American man to join the military. Those were their opportunities. But despite all that, there was expectation in my home to do different. But what I've learned going through school myself as a student, there were times when that was not afforded to me at school. There were times I had to shed my identity as a student, as a teacher, as a leader, and that's not okay. So when I think about my why, I actually move to who. Who do we show up for every day? Who are we serving? Who are we providing opportunities? Who do we provide support? And most importantly, who do we have high expectations and we're going to help them get there? So really that's my why. Is the work I do within the schools is to help us identify these opportunities and supports, and also to name when our bias and our racist practices get in the way of doing that for students and having high expectations. And so when I think about trust, I think it was said a few times, but I would say consistency. So showing up consistently in whatever way you do, but also being seen. So I feel like when you think about trust, it's who authentically sees you and values you and includes you. And that's when you develop trust, is when you are truly seen for who you are.
Nice. I love that, being seen. That's so important. Um, okay, we also have Miss Emma. Miss Emma, can you talk about your why and your definition of trust?
Yeah, my why is I did 33 years with the county, and why? Because I saw that our county had wonderful, rich resources when I first started, and we were the richest county in the country, or at least in the top 5. But I noticed that there was differences between parts of the county. You go to a southern end, you go to the northern end, and the access was limited to certain folk. And I thought that was interesting because we have a county government and a county school system and all this that overarches the whole county, not just Springfield or Burke or whatever. And so my why was, how can I help be an advocate for the community and make sure they had access to all of the wonderful wealth we have of resources that all these different persuasions that we're talking about now. Mm-hmm. And trust for me is confidence in someone telling the truth. I always found that our community a lot of times didn't trust people, our community, talking about African-American communities, people of color communities, because people would give a lot of lip service, but never seem to follow through. And so they would stop and start and stop and start, and different people would come in. And I thought, oh my, we don't trust them. And so I think trust is also being able to support someone, to advocate for them, and to be there for them and tell them the truth. Difficult conversations we can have, because we always talk about having those difficult conversations, but I think most of us do not have them. And I say, let's have a difficult conversation and be there for folks. And even if the conversation is difficult, how then can we help them access all the wonderful people that I see on this Zoom now that have access? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, access for all. All right, Mr. Solomon, you're up.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. When I think about the why I do this work, for me, truly, I was fortunate enough early on to learn and truly embrace that one person can make a difference. And I think that it's so important to go into any profession to have self-awareness, knowing what you're bringing to that profession. And I think that we should all be striving to live a purposeful, driven life, a life with purpose and meaning. And legacy is all important, because what kind of impact are you making on this world? What kind of difference are you having in helping people get to a place of comfort, success, sustainability, empowering them? And I believe that relationships matter. So being able to form healthy relationships is one of those dynamics that's able to move people forward as you go about embracing change and making a positive impact on others. And I think that as you go through and you think about the inherent strengths of individuals, I'm really trying to put value in people's life and give hope. I think hope is so important as a driving force that motivates people to change, to motivate people to kind of see things differently. So I think as you embrace any profession, I think it's important for you to have self-awareness and what value you're giving to that profession. When I think about trust, it is on the lines of everything else that was shared so far, being reliable, having true character, a moral compass, and and showing integrity. I think that's important, that you can have trust and have being assumed to have good intentions over the work that you're performing, over the communications that you're having. So showing integrity and having true positive intention.
Wow. Yes. So I heard reliability, telling the truth, no lip service, being an advocate, and empowering others. So with that, we're going to go ahead and roll into this evening. We're going to start off with a polling question because we're going to start in youth mental health. And I'd like for us to bring up, Amanda, please, the first polling question in mental health. And so this is where everybody can participate. Please answer this question. What role does stigma play in the Black community's engagement or lack thereof with the youth mental health system? Is it mild, moderate, or is it profound? We're talking about stigma here now. And it's seeming like it's overwhelmingly profound. I'm gonna give it a couple more seconds here for those who are still weighing in. And if you don't have this capability, just throw your answer in the chat box as well. All right, we got about 5 more seconds if you're going to answer. We just got a couple people who have. All right, I'm going to share the results. And you can see 78% feel like the stigma is impacting. And then about 22% say it's moderate. So I'd like to turn this over to our 2 experts on the panel, D'Angelo and Kashana. And if you could both just start to delve into this question, what is it about stigma in the Black community that's impacting individuals in the mental health, with the youth mental health system?
Let you start, D'Angelo.
Got it. So I mean, when it comes to those stigmas, I mean, you also got to look at, when you look at our community, how often do we even communicate and talk about our problems, especially those things that's going on internally. So you got that factor there of not being able to really communicate, really, not just communicate to the system, though I'm a mental health therapist, but really even communicate within your own family on what's going on. So there's that difficulty in that layer there with trying to communicate what's happening inside or what's going on. So not only that, not being, and this kind of goes back to the conversation about trust, and I know we're gonna get more into it, just not having someone to really trust when it comes to those things that's bothering an individual. But not only that, you also have, hearing about misdiagnosis. You have parents who don't want their children to be diagnosed with certain disorders, or I'm afraid my child is going to be diagnosed with ADHD, then they got to be medicated and so on and so forth. Now they're in the system. Now this is going to open up all kinds of other things and people in our business. So you have, I mean, you have that factor there. On top of just the fact of not trusting the healthcare system, if you just look at the different things that we've experienced as African Americans as it relates to healthcare, and things not citing in our favor, just that whole history that we have there, that plays a huge part too. So I mean, those, I'm just listing off some right now. Kashana, please feel free to chime in if you have any that I'm missing out.
Absolutely. I personally, it played the stigma played a big role in my life because I was uneducated on mental health. I didn't know what mental health was until my daughter was 12 years old and exhibiting behaviors that I had never seen before out of a 12-year-old child. Example, having sex in school, homosexuality. I'm from a Christian background. This was not normal to me. And what is going on? And she was very defiant at that time as well. And I had no one to run to. It was, oh, you need to whoop her a little bit more. That's what we hear in our community. We hear that a lot. What are you doing as a parent? Not only was my husband not her biological father, he's her stepfather. What are you and your husband doing? Why is she? There's got to be a reason that you're parenting, because we as a community are not aware of oppositional defiance disorder, ADHD, all these acronyms, right? Parents don't know what that is. I did not know until I was well into my 30s and I had a teenage child. I was so far behind. And again, that is why I do what I do, not only to educate other parents, but also to raise awareness in our community, because it's not about whooping our kids a little bit more. It's about paying attention to those behaviors, educating yourself on your child's behaviors, reaching out, not being embarrassed. Because one thing we are judged when our children do misbehave, right? You see that child acting up in the store screaming. You don't know if that child is suffering from autism. You have no clue the trauma that child has went through. But again, until I educated myself, I could not help my child. So again, it's not just about whooping.
Yeah, so that's great that you brought that up, because someone else put in the chat box, system is full of people who do not understand us, our culture. We have a history of needing to care for our own. And then someone else said, well, I said assigning blame is one of the things that we see often, which drives even further the issues that we have with stigmas, but also, and the answer isn't spanking. And so those are things that you brought up. So if we're thinking about that's not the answer, what is the answer that we should be seeking?
I would say to reach out for resources that are in front of you. So if it's your natural supports, maybe not be so afraid to reach, meaning your mother or your sister, that school social worker, someone that you feel that you can trust. That's where I would start from. My child, she was on probation, unfortunately. And my child's juvenile probation officer changed our life. I would just say, again, you have to let your guard down and not be in denial if your child is exhibiting behaviors that are just not normal to you.
Mm-hmm. Angelo?
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off what Keshana said, I think a common response is being defensive. And going back to what she mentioned as far as letting your guard down, that's, you got to get to that point where you're able to, okay, I'm going to let my guard down. I'm going to approach this differently. We're doing, these whoopings and these ways we've been doing things obviously has not been working, and the behaviors are continuing on. It's just perpetuating that the negativity, that negative ways of coping with, I guess whatever the situation is. But definitely, being able to let your guard down and seeking out those resources that are out there. I know we're talking about, mental health therapists, that you may look like you or could identify you. I know we're talking about different ways that us professionals can respond in a culturally responsive, manner. But also, like she mentioned, school social workers. Maybe there's a coach or someone that you do trust, or somebody that has a connection and kind of knows what's going on, that can provide some type of assistance.
Yeah. So going back to what was said about trust, both of you just said something. You said start to let your guard down. And Keshana, you said earlier that you don't want people outside the household to know what's going on. So given that, what role does trust play with the Black parent or caregiver accessing or utilizing youth services for mental health? You're on mute.
It's hard. It's extremely hard. I mean, I had CPS in my house, I would say more than 20 times. So trust, I didn't have any trust. I had to believe, and I had to connect. And the person that I connected with did not look like me. Meaning he was a middle-aged white male. That's who I ended up connecting with. So it doesn't matter. The person doesn't have to look like you, right? Obviously, they can relate to you maybe a little bit more, but I had to, again, he was the one that I was able to trust in. He listened to me. He heard me. He wasn't judging me. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It did come up before about trusting someone who doesn't look like us. And you just gave a great example about being able to trust someone who doesn't look like us. And so I think that it goes back to finding the right person. You're going to have advocates and allies who don't look like you, but you're going to have to reach out to them. So thanks for helping to kind of bring down that wall when we start talking about who can we trust. Go ahead, D'Angelo. Oh, somebody was.
It was me. I'm sorry. If I could add to that. So when you think about the Black community and the profound effect that mental health plays in far as relationships and not trusting, letting, going to seek services for mental health, that is another label that is put on that person. And I think it's so important that you have the right messaging that mental health, we need to start normalizing mental health. There, folks are walking around that suffer from mental health deficits that's not the end of their life. That's not the end of their way of living. There's ways that we can manage mental health, but that messaging is not there. So, and that we've already internalized that we don't need any more labels, and we know what labeling does and how, that closes doors for us, and people look at us with that, negative, label and kind of the way they can address us. So being mindful of, is there right people, and how is mental health being messaged to the youth, to the parent, to the caretaker? How is that being messaged to them where it's not the end of the world, but it's almost normalized and it's presented in a way that we can manage it, putting the right services and supports in place, not just going that this is another label that we're going to have to now try to figure out overcoming and putting up more barriers for us to kind of manage and fight through.
Yeah, Solomon, you said something that's key, and I was just looking at a comment that was in the chat box, because a lot of times in the community, when we talk about mental health, it is interlacing, or people think that mental health and mental illness are the same thing, and they're not. Because mental health, everybody has, just like they have physical health.
Yes.
And mental illness is something that requires assistance to get through. And so someone put in here, as African Americans, we need to accept reality and not associate mental illness with shame. And so if we can start to normalize the conversation around mental health, when you do get to that break point where it turns into mental illness, then that helps to decrease the stigma. Is that, I see D'Angelo shaking his head really hard, but Solomon, can you speak on that a little bit more, that you were on vein with that?
Yeah, I would just say definitely being mindful of the communication regarding mental health and the breakdown you just gave us, mental health and mental illness, and going to the right person when they're steering that youth or that individual into forms of mental diagnosis and mental health, that you are clearly advocating and trying to empower what actually is going on regarding mental health and mental illness and the behaviors that are being exhibited. Because sometimes we know in the Black community it's overdiagnosed mental health and mental illness, or misdiagnosis, because that's just an easy way to put a Band-Aid on a kid is acting up because they're not being engaged the way that they need to be engaged, and we'll put a label, oh, this kid has ADHD. So it's definitely a fine line to be cautioned to kind of make sure that they're sitting and you have an open mind and kind of open dialogue to hear everything out, because and specifically in one classroom, a kid may be exhibiting certain behavior, another class, they're not. We don't want to just jump to say, okay, this is ADD. No, it may be some element or some issues that's going on in that particular situation that need to be isolated and addressed and talked about. So I think that's just an important piece that we have to consider as well. Like I said, the messaging piece.
Yeah, and I think that goes right in line with what our next polling question is for mental health, because sometimes when there's diagnosis or the misdiagnosis, that could push an individual over the edge as well. So if we could pull up the next question here, and I want to read this out the chat box while the question's coming up, but Angela put in here, public school teachers are 82% white. How much would having teachers of color help students of color deal with these types of issues? So we'll talk about that as well. But I wanted to put this question up because we talk about those crises that we can find ourselves in. So suicide is the second leading cause of death in Black youth ages 10 to 19. Is that true or false? All right, most everybody is. We'll give about 10 more seconds if you could go ahead and weigh in on the polling question. And it looks like overwhelmingly that the audience here today believes that that is true. So in the polling, it's 91%. I'm going to share the results. Oops, sorry. 91% believe that it is, and then 9% says that they believe it's false. So we can weigh in on this just a little bit. D'Angelo, I'd like to start with you. What is your beliefs on this, or what is your position on this?
I can, definitely see why many people will say it's true. I don't have the exact statistic or a fact in front of me, so I don't want to quote it or say anything wrong. Going back to just, African Americans and African Black youth not really being able to communicate what's going on internally, it could lead to some of those negative ways of coping. That could be drug use. That could be, and it could go all the way to suicide if it goes in, if it's depression or whatever it is, if it leads them down that direction. But just not having that ability to really communicate, or not having that space or having that trust that you can communicate what's going on with you to someone. I can definitely see how someone feels trapped and to lead them down that path.
Yes, and we do know that suicide is on the rise in all communities, and even more so since COVID. So that is something that we need to be mindful of, and finding out where those resources are available so that we can ensure that people get the right answers. And the answer is true.
Right, it is true.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start to shift the conversation a little bit more, because now we've been talking about education a little bit more with the comment about the public school system, that 82% of the teachers are white, and I cannot verify that information because I don't know if it's true or not. But I'd like for us to shift the conversation right now into the area of education, and so we're going to go ahead and bring Ms. Leona into the conversation and give us your position on how there's concerns of trust in the education system when it comes to the Black community.
Sure. I want to address first just this idea about the diversity and about, I loved how Kishana shared also her story. Is it Kishana or Kishana? Kishana? I love how she shared her story too, because I think it's important to understand that there's power in finding support with folks that look like us, and also power when it comes from other places. And I think the key tends to be when we find someone who wants to liberate us versus somebody who wants to save us. Nobody wants to be saved, because to be saved implies that you can't do it yourself and that there's something wrong with you. But if we acknowledge that we have systems of oppression and there's things that have been going on, when we find someone who can empower us and liberate us, no matter what color they look like, now that's freeing. And I think that's what we're looking for, is that goes back to sort of what I was sharing before about who sees us, who's not going to speak on the mic for us, but who's going to pass the mic to us, right? And help us do that and help us get to the point where we can hold the mic ourselves. So I wanted to speak on that, but I do think comments around diversity in our teaching workforce does play a role in trust building. So although I do believe that liberation can come from all sorts of places, I do also believe we have a problem in our school system. I don't know if that statistic is right overall. I don't have in front of me all of education, but I will acknowledge Fairfax County Public Schools does not have enough diversity in our teaching staff, and particularly Black teachers. It is disproportionate to our students, and we all know representation matters for a lot of reasons, not just for kids to see heroes and for hope, but also for perspective. And so I do think that when you have more teachers of color and those that can relate to cultures out other cultures, then you have less incidents where people don't act or make decisions upon biases or lack of knowledge of culture. So that's where trust gets broken down, because people are making decisions without knowledge of culture, without knowledge of people, based off assumptions, sometimes explicit bias, sometimes implicit. I'll give you guys a quick story. And this is an example of where had there just been someone of color on that staff, this wouldn't have happened. And this is where trust breaks down. We had a beautiful young lady, 4th grade student, I won't name the school, showed up on the first day of Black History Month. Her whole family bought these shirts. The shirt was amazing. It said, "Black girls are lit." She came into school, her shirt was on, she was ready. And immediately she was at a predominantly white school, probably one of 10 Black children there, no Black teachers. The students, something about seeing the word Black, they started giggling, "What's your shirt about?" Then they're like, "Lit, ooh, what's lit?" And then the teacher, not knowledgeable about pop culture or whatever culture you might consider that word, because lit can mean lots of things, but they meant lit in a good aspirational way. That teacher felt like, so when the little girl went over to her and said, "Hey, they're making fun of me. Why are they making fun of my shirt? Because it's Black? Are they racist?" The teacher didn't know what to do. So what she says to her, "Turn your shirt inside out." The little girl listened. And then she went on about her day, but then something didn't sit right in her soul, because we know when someone is unintentionally or intentionally oppressing us. And so then she went to the next teacher she encountered. "My shirt's inside out." And so that teacher, not knowing, says, "Turn it back around." So she turns it back around. And this went on through the day where other teachers, so finally somebody went to the administration and said, "This shirt is causing a lot of disruption." No one stopped to ask this child, "What does the shirt mean?" No one said, "Teach me about this shirt. What made you feel so empowered to wear it today?" So instead, that administrator, who was also afraid, and again, I don't always think it's malintent, it's misinformation, it's implicit bias. That administrator said, "Go ahead and take the shirt off." And then she called the mother to say, "We don't promote that kind of thing here." What kind of thing? What did she assume this mother sent her 9-year-old to do? And so I'm not going to paint this picture that FCPS has gotten it right, because we haven't. But I think these are examples where, had there been more dialogue to seek to understand first, to authentically build relationships, to talk to someone and not just go off of your normal status quo, that doesn't seem right, and because it doesn't feel right to what I know, it must be wrong. That's where trust gets broken down. So when we can start to name these kind of situations, study them, learn about them, teach about where bias shows up, and hire teachers of color, that's when we can begin to somewhat rebuild trust. I think as a Black mother myself, I have 4 children, 3 are boys. And there are times that the system I work in was not good for them, and I had to use my voice. And so I think that there's cause to be distrustful at times, but it's conversations like this where I do think we have people who want to hear different and know different. We've got to talk about it.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. I love the storytelling because that's true, but it helps us to really get a picture of what is the issue at hand. And someone says that no one looked it up on Google, didn't understand or assumed that it was negative.
Nobody, I said the same thing. Nobody pulled out their smartphone. Lit, Urban Dictionary. What does lit mean?
Yes.
But no one thought of that. What they thought about is status quo, what's normalized. And a bunch of people felt uncomfortable, and so they chose them over seeking to understand. And that's where trust breaks down, when we make decisions for adults and for comfort, and we should ask ourselves, for whose comfort?
Yeah. So I'd like for us to launch a poll real quick, because you hit on some stuff and I see that Ms. Angela DeHart says, "I'm a Black retired Fairfax County public school teacher." So if we can launch the first question here, so this would help us to gauge a couple of things. Is there anyone in your home that is currently enrolled in Fairfax County Public School? So there's a lot of folks have children in school. Give it a couple more seconds. If you haven't answered the poll, can you please just weigh in? We would appreciate it. And someone also put another resource. Oh, Andrea put a resource in here. All right. Let me end the poll real quick. So we have about 29 individuals who have children in the Fairfax school system. So this is critical for us to understand, because you talked a little bit about this, but what role does cultural awareness and cultural humility play in the education of our Black youth?
Yeah. What I think about, we talk a lot about the prison to pipeline. I mean, the school to prison pipeline, all these decisions that we make. So we talk a lot about being culturally responsive. And so all teaching is culturally responsive, but to who? Which culture? And we tend to normalize the predominant culture, which is white culture. Often we have a Eurocentric curriculum. All these things show up in our everyday. And so in order to really start to dismantle this and rebuild trust, we do have to be more culturally responsive. So that's some of the great work I get to do, thankfully, in my office, is we work with specialists that create professional development for teachers and staff, all types of staff, to really think about what is culture. So we've been on this journey over the last 3 years of what is culture. And people think culture is just race, or maybe also language, but culture is any group you identify with. Now, we know historically in America, racism is still predominant, especially what's happened historically to Black and African Americans, but really culture is everything. And so we've taken time to first understand what is culture, but then now we've moved into, if you are culturally responsive, you are authentically pausing to get to know your kids' cultures and think about how that impacts you and your own culture when you make decisions. So when you decide what resource to pull when you teach that, when you decide what book you're going to choose, when you decide how you're going to engage, when you decide the assumptions, whether you realize it or not, about what's happening in a child's home, that's being culturally responsive. And we haven't been transparent enough about that. We tend to talk about, well, if you just teach them well and you use these good best practices teachings, they'll be okay. But we know that's not true, because we have years and years of patterns of inequities, years and years of gaps that says not true. So until we start naming that, that's what we need to do. So I truly believe being culturally responsive in our teaching and our decision making is paramount. And you have to intentionally study that. It doesn't just happen because you hope better things for kids. It doesn't just happen because you watch, if you go through Twitter a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to really engage in this work to understand other cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. And you, Leona, you said something that I want us to go back to. You said the school to prison pipeline. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What is that, and how does not being culturally competent impact how people end up in that pipeline, or our Black children end up in that pipeline?
Well, there's a lot of data out there for folks who want to look into that. But if you think about it, oftentimes in schools, we're almost policing children, the way we interact with them, right? The way in which we decide which behaviors are normalized and which behaviors are not. Who do we see as aggressive versus who do we see as playful? And so, or joyful or developmental, because they're just a little boy who's in first grade, and that's what little boys do, right? So what ends up happening when we talk about this pipeline, we talk about early on having these biases that show up, and we start putting kids into the discipline process. And so we start putting things. So I want to be careful with this idea of labeling, because we don't want to send mixed messages. We don't want to over label, but we don't want to under support either, right? We are still talking about, there are times when we do need support for kids. I think we've heard some good stories around that today, but really, if you look at our history, we do tend to over identify in particular brown and Black boys. And so what happens is we put them in discipline systems, we remove them from our classrooms, we put them in special education, and they end up in this, when I talked about culture before, that becomes their identity. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of, let's have lower and lower expectations for them. And they end up in places like alternative high schools, and they end up engaging in risky behaviors, all those things we've heard talk about before, when all they needed someone before was to just get to know them and understand developmentally, all little kids act like this, and believe in them and support them. So when we talk about prison pipeline, we're talking about the decisions we make early on to segregate certain children, to discipline them, that it becomes this domino effect later, because they're not in the classroom. So when you're not in the classroom, guess what? You're not learning. So how can we talk about hope and opportunity when you're not learning? So that's what we mean by this prison pipeline, and why being culturally responsive and understanding culture deeply and understanding racism is the only way to dismantle it. And also looking at your own data. That's a new thing I will say that we're in a journey this year, is being very transparent with our discipline data and having questions like, look at this teacher who sent 10 kids to the office last year versus this teacher that sent 40. And by the way, all 40 happen to be brown children. Right? So those are the conversations that have to happen right now.
Yeah. And so, and that goes back to that unconscious bias. And sometimes it's not unconscious, it's conscious. And so it's deliberate. And so not holding anyone accountable for that is also what furthers the issue with trust.
Can I say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Can I just say something? I appreciate this young lady who's talking, and I agree with her wholeheartedly. I just want to give a very brief story. My son was a school health aide in a school down in South County. And he was a young Black man. And so when we start talking about diversity in the school, we're talking about all around diversity, not just the janitors and the folks in the cafeteria. But my son would have, 20 to 30 kids come to see him every day because they wanted to see him. And they always had a cold or a cough, and Mr. Alex, they were always up under him. And they would say to him, some of the kids say, can you be my father? Can I go home with you? And some of those teachers were quite cruel to those children when you look behind the scenes when no one was looking. And my son was very disturbed about that. When he would be out, like on a vacation or whatnot, they say, yeah, only 3 or 4 kids came to down here. And they asked if you were in. And when they said you weren't in, I guess the kids are like, we are a telegraph wire and they network. Don't go down there today. He's not there. And so I said, wow, isn't that something? Because they loved to be around his strength and his kindness, because he was always very kind to the kids and welcoming them in. And they told him, well, you can't be kind to him because then they'll all come to your office. And I thought, wow, that's a little harsh. But I mean, kids of all nationalities. So I always say, you need everyone in a school, regardless if there's 100% white or 100% Black. You need a whole plethora of folks so they see them dressed and gain respect for them, and not just think they only do one thing. They're the cafeteria folks, or they're the gym teacher. But we need that whole rounded. And Fairfax County, whether I agree with you, Ms. Haley, Dr. Haley, whether it's conscious or unconscious, I've been here 33 years and it's been the same way. Yeah. And they've been talking about it, but never really holding people accountable for it.
Yes, and that's part of what we have to figure out how to get to a solution on, is how to hold people accountable. So I want to launch this last question in the education area, and then we're going to switch lanes because you already touched on this. How much of the time do you think you can trust the education system to do what's right for Black youth and families? That's what that whole conversation just was about, that last few minutes there. So we're getting a lot of hardly ever. The options are just about always, most of the time, only some of the time, and hardly ever. And so the majority of the responses are in only some of the time, and then hardly ever. And so I'll just leave the poll up here for just a couple more seconds if you still want to weigh in. And I'll share the results. All right. And so is that surprising to you, Leona?
No, not at all. It's why I took this job. So I was a principal prior to this and love being a principal. So it's hard when I see data like this, because I first think about myself as a leader and I'm like, they could trust me. I know they could, but I know that that wasn't everywhere, because if I believed that, I wouldn't have left my position to go into this position. And also my own children go to the school system, but I haven't lost hope either. And so I want to say that if I've lost hope, I wouldn't show up every day. I do believe that we can, no matter what, continuously think about how to make a difference. And when I read some of the comments around like putting kids in the hallway or things not happening, this is where I'm going to say, you know, use your voice and ask those questions. This is where we're not truth telling for exposure. We're truth telling for liberation, right? We talked about liberation already. And so I believe we are at a critical point in our school system that we've never been in before. I got to be honest, guys, we couldn't even say the word racism 2 years ago. Like when I was given professional development, I couldn't even say racism. I had to say other things around it. But we are being truth tellers now. And so I say, if you have stories, you need to tell them. You need to speak up and say, this is not okay. But then say, how can I help? Because the only other thing I want to say, it never helps us when we all sit around and begin to attack organizations or attack each other as parents or attack other people. That doesn't make change either. We need to be truth tellers, but partners. And so this is the first step coming tonight. Then go to your child's school and say, listen, I know you've been working on this, but what I'm noticing is it's not changing over here. How can I help?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so in our own truth telling, then we need to find options and not just to talk to be talking. That's really what this is all about. And so going back to, you just made light of what was put in the comments about the throwing the children into the hallway. So that's going to take us right into the segment on talking about child welfare, because it happens at school, but a lot of times it happens at home. And so I want us to go ahead and Miss Emma, go ahead and weigh in on this portion of it. We can launch a poll question to start this off though. How much trust do you have in the child welfare system to do the right thing, to do what's right for Black families? Yeah, you guys are going really fast now, so thank you for that. Give it about another 10 seconds here. And so overwhelmingly, I'm seeing that some and then none, but not a lot. Let's share the results there. So Ms. Emma, with that, we're going to ask you to go ahead and weigh in. How much trust do you see in the child welfare system? We've heard a little bit from you, but we want you to go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into this discussion about child welfare.
Well, it's a large system. It has a plethora of things. But my first thing is families, just with all of these systems we've talked about, need to advocate, advocate, advocate. You need to be in there. Don't just think or trust that everyone you encounter in these systems actually know more than you and are for you. You know your family, you know your child, you need to be in there and advocate. I dealt with foster care, and then there's CPS, and then there's PPS, which is prevention, children remaining in their homes. And for, again, 33 years, we have been teaching our rest of our staff, our peers. We have been dialoguing with our peers. We have been doing a lot of things with our peers to let them know to meet families where they are and to teach some type of cultural competency. You'd think that wouldn't be a big deal, but unfortunately it is. A lot of our younger workers, some of them, a lot, come from different parts of the country and aren't understanding of Virginia and African Americans and people of color here in Virginia. I say to everyone, yes, you know racism, and I love when the young lady said they couldn't even say racism in the school, because we did a training for the school and the school counselors, and I said racism all the time, and they were clutching their pearls like, oh my God, no, she didn't. And these were like 10, 20 years ago, because that's what it was. Because we never named anything, so everybody could skirt around it and pretend that, oh no, we love everybody. I said, you may love everybody, but somehow you're not loving our children. So I say that you can trust them to a point, but if they don't understand your culture, if they don't understand the dynamics of your family, I do agree. Sometimes diagnosis is diagnosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, that's that. But on top of that, and trauma, but on top of all that, which we're also learning more of, we're dealing with trauma, there's that thing that African Americans have to go through, and that's racism, which is on top of all the other things that we're dealing with in our community. And I think that's the key that we're trying to, and now we have the one Fairfax, which I'm praying will make sure that helps us understand it. But I don't know, if you don't hold people accountable, then they don't care about understanding it. And that's what we tried to hold folks accountable, so that they could trust when a child protective service worker walked into your family. Back in the day, we would notice that they would bring more African-American children in care and leave more white children at home to their families, and bring in again that access to services. And our families were, their kids were out of the home. And all the different Casey foundations, all the different studies say out of the home isn't good. So now we're doing the wraparound, you know, we're maintaining them in the home and trying to give them. But I also worried when they found out that we were bringing, you know, 50-some% of our children were coming into care as opposed to 30% of other folks, that they would stop then bringing kids who actually need to come in, because there actually is abuse, or we wouldn't be in, I wouldn't have had, you know, been in a job for a long time. I also employ Black folk, because I've been begging them for years to become foster parents. So when my child is out of my home and he's a Black child, or he's a Latino child, or they can go to a home that has some cultural competency and understands them. And they're not trying to fight an uphill battle in a system that the kids don't know what they feel like they are the victim, because we victimize them by pulling them out of their home, out of all their family, out of their schools. But now we have a new school policy. We have to keep them close to school. But I don't know, you know, I sort of a little on the fence with, can you trust them? Can't you trust them? Because I worked with them and I wanted to believe the best of everybody. But sometimes the best of everybody isn't there, and maybe subconsciously, you know, they would say, well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So they wouldn't go look for relatives. My thing is, well, let's look for relatives. Just because they're down on a certain neighborhood in a certain area of the county, instantly everybody would say, yeah, that neighborhood, yeah, they all live there. Nah, nobody's good there. And I would think, well, why not? Somebody's going to work down there. Everybody's not staying in the house and doing things. So we had to constantly keep educating the workers, and understand these are just regular folks like you and me. They got kids, they may not have kids. You've got to advocate for your child. You've got to show up to the court. You've got to show up to an office and not be belligerent or angry, but show up. Just like in school, you've got to show up and you've got to advocate. Don't think folks are going to do it for you. They have nothing and they have no skin in that game. But we do. So we've got to show up. If we want to have trust, we need to show trust, and we need to show we're trying to actively participate in our children's lives, and we'll hold folk accountable. So if an immediate worker doesn't work out, keep climbing that ladder till you get to the top. Don't be frightened of, oh, I don't want to get anybody in trouble. It's not about getting in trouble. It's about making sure you have access, you get the resources you need, and that you're the advocate for your child.
Yeah. So in being the advocate for your child, a lot of people a lot of the things that you just said, a lot of people are not educated enough on those topics. So how do you propose that we better educate people who find themselves in the system, in the child welfare system, so that they know what to do?
I think the child welfare system needs to do more education in the community. Now, understand, my field, child protective service, and my field of foster care is a very confidential thing. So I can't tell anybody if the child is there or not there. You know, a grandparent may call and say, oh, I heard that my children, and I can't say anything because it's confidential. But if we continue to have these kind of community chats with child welfare workers, going out to the different churches, that's where I used to go to, wonderful churches all over the county that would have folk come in and talk. We need to educate people. It's not a secret anymore. People know there's child welfare. and there's not a secret of what we can do, how we can help them. And we need not just giving food stamps and giving, help paying a light bill, but there's other things we can do. Help hook them up with CSB, hook them up with folks in the school. We need to do a better job in educating them, which means we need to make sure we bring more programs. Now, one of the programs that I worked for that wasn't in Department of Family Services was NCS, because NCS was always out in the community. And so we need to tag in with them.
What's NCS?
Oh, community service, and a neighborhood and community
services. Yes.
Yeah, they changed their names. I'm sorry. I'm doing that
No
horrible
problem,
name. They're always in the community, and they would always tap into me, and I'd rush out as soon as they said they were going somewhere, because then I could be out in front and talk to people, so they could get to know a child welfare worker. They could get to know someone they could call and they could trust. So I think we need to have better, PR in the community.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also, and thank you for that, but I also see in the chat that we're talking, there's a couple of comments in here about some parents are part of the problem, and we need, what do we recommend for people helping the children living with violent parents? And then there was another comment here is, I am helping a student whose father is violent. Mm-hmm. So that goes right into the next question that I wanted to launch is, for the polling, do you know who to contact if you have a concern about a child's welfare? So if you guys can go ahead in the virtual world and weigh in on that. Some people are saying yes, some people are saying no. And we'll give it a couple more seconds here, about 10 more seconds. And even if we're talking about, even if you don't live in this area, do you know who to contact? Okay, so the majority say that they know who to contact. So can you talk a little bit about who they should be contacting?
Yes, we have a Child Protective Service arm that does the investigations. And unfortunately, our schools were one of the best advocates because they would see kids every day. So they would come in and, they would call Child Protective Service. But you can call the Child Protective Service with Department of Family Service. You can go on the website of fairfaxcounty.gov and go into child, youth, and family, and there's all kinds of numbers in there that talks about Child Protective Service. And once you tell them, they don't reveal who the caller is and all that kind of stuff, and they will have a conference as to the rating of the seriousness of what someone is calling in about, whatever the abuse is or what they've witnessed, and they may question them a little more to get more information. But they can always contact Child Protective Service no matter where they are in the country. Every state, every county in the country has a Child Protective Service that does just that, goes out and looks at the welfare of children. And we have a wonderful one here.
Yeah.
And they are correct. Sometimes it is the parents, but that's why I say our African-American community needs to come forward and become foster parents. You're concerned about them, please. We need more advocates or even a court special appointed, Solomon, help me, CASA, court special appointed advocate. You can do that.
Yeah.
Because that goes and they go in and they're impartial and they look at what the agency is doing, Department of Family Services is doing, and what the family is doing and what's the best for a child. And so please volunteer for those community things in your community or become a foster parent, because that helps us have balance there. And yes, some children do need to come out of the family. That's what I'm saying. They do need, but you can call Child Protective Service.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Emma. And I think that it's critical for us to realize as we transition into the juvenile justice system that part of what happens is if children are remaining in a household that is violent, that they often find themselves in trouble. They're acting out, they're running away, and then they find themselves in the juvenile justice system. So with that, I'm going to transition to Solomon. And if you could come on and tell us a little bit about what's some of the concerns with trust in the juvenile justice system when it comes to the Black community.
Well, it's truly all of the things that we just touched on. And when you think about the juvenile justice system, um, not spending time, whoever is at that decision-making point, not spending time. I always used to say this in the juvenile justice, the behaviors are symptomatic of something else that is going on. So it could be the violence in the home. It could be, the fact that they have some mental health that's not being properly addressed. So oftentimes you're just looking at the behaviors, and we have to address the behaviors, specifically in the Black community. The negative label, they should know better. We're not accounting for all of these other factors and some of the driving forces that encourage, that influence those behaviors. And when you think about the Black community, I mean, even I was thinking about jotting down notes, great discussion in the mental health field, in the educational system. There's a devaluation of the Black life. I mean, it's already you're faced with this negative stigma that you're not going to be successful. So the minute that you engage in any behavior, because those relationships are lacking, because the people who are making primarily that's influencing these decisions and making these decisions don't look like the population that they're serving, that implicit bias is huge. Implicit bias, we talk so much about implicit bias, and I always like to discuss, when you talk about implicit bias, those driving forces that are unconscious, that's forcing you to pass judgment, make decisions, that goes both ways. So when you think about youth, juvenile justice system, some of those behaviors that you see, they have implicit bias that's showing up in those behaviors that they're exhibiting, because they don't trust that this person has the best intentions for them. So then they have this element of resistance, and you see it play out in the juvenile justice system, where you might have a social history or intake narrative written out with all these negative connotations, because they put their own judgments into the decision making to influence certain decision making. So you definitely have to be wary and being mindful of what's happening in the juvenile justice system, and kind of slowing down, taking out those emotional triggers, keeping in mind that, yes, the implicit bias may be showing up because this officer arrived on the scene and doesn't look like the kid, assuming negative intention, and those relationships are not there. So that level of engagement creates perhaps a hostile environment. So there's a lot of factors I think that we have to consider when you think about juvenile justice reform and the lack of trust. A lot of the time, the decision makers in the juvenile justice system, implicit biases, and they've done multiple research studies on how, decision making has been carried out, and they can kind of account for implicit bias that was at play.
Yeah, and so Solomon, that's a great point. The research is there, and it's constant. It doesn't seem to decrease. Unfortunately, seems to increase when it comes to implicit bias. And so I'm sure that there are people on this in this forum tonight who have been touched by the juvenile justice system. So I'd like to put up the polling question, the first one from juvenile justice, just so we can kind of get it to gauge. And again, remember that this was anonymous. We will not be able to tell who said what, but have you or someone in your immediate family had an encounter with the juvenile justice system? We'll give it about 10 more seconds here. It's looking like about 50% here. So I'll just ask you, Solomon, is that shocking to you that about a half of this audience has had an encounter with the juvenile justice system?
Not at all. Of course, not at all. It's unfortunate when you think about the juvenile justice system and the reform that has to take place. That's an ongoing, continuous process. In the Black community, working with juveniles, there's always been this degree of or lack of patience, lack of empathy, lack of compassion, and really slowing down. When you think about the juvenile justice system, one of the things I'm proud to have been a part of with JDRDC, Juvenile Domestic Relations Court in Fairfax County, is slowing down that process from the rate of offense to disposition. We know in going to court that 99.9% of the time cases resolved in a plea agreement, where you're kind of looking at the offense and then you're automatically going to kind of have an outcome or a disposition for that case. So being a part of slowing down that process to consider all of the factors that are involved, doing assessments, trauma assessments, risk and needs assessments, to kind of not write that kid off. Again, going back to the devaluation of the Black life and lack of investment. So, it's definitely not shocking, because I think it's important that, we're being mindful of what role we play in the decision-making process and influence. Like Ms. Emma said, getting involved, being present, asking, like Leona mentioned, some of those why questions. We talk about accountability. Well, why did you do this? Why wasn't this option considered? Instead of just assuming, well, this is the way it is, and these are the outcomes I have to deal with. There is a better way. So I think that, it was a quick reaction before, and I think the juvenile justice system, as we go through and we're considering the adolescent brain development, that decisions are made that, we have to kind of pull back when we think about holding that kid accountable. Well, based on their development, that we may need to work on coaching and educating and counseling and kind of really looking at ways that we can truly address the needs of our individuals and families, instead of having a punitive approach when you think about the juvenile justice system, but more of a reform and education and a rehabilitative stance.
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. It's the point is to rehab and not to just to punish. And
Yes.
So with that, I know that I believe it was Leona talked about the school to prison pipeline. I'd like to hear from your perspective about the school to prison pipeline and why there's so much distrust around that in the Black community.
So, working in juvenile justice and working as part of being a juvenile probation officer previously, and having to associate and work with the schools as well. Again, the relationships in the school system, having staff not reflective of the people they're serving, implicit bias is at play. Also in the school system, see, a lot of times we talk about systemic racism, but a lot of times, often what we see is self-mediated racism, because of the kids know and have internalized that devaluation, that lack of investment. Specifically, you think about in the school system, there has been lower standards, lowering the standards and expectations.
Mm-hmm.
We have in Fairfax County, a majority of our youth are funneled into the alternative school system, where they're not getting the proper education, where teachers are not held accountable to meet the needs of the kids. And therefore, and they're not being talked to. When I think of I mentioned before the impact of messaging, they're not giving kids hope that there is greater opportunity out there for them. Oh, a kid loves the fact that he can go in the classroom, put his head down, still get a passing grade, or get socially promoted. They have devalued that youth's life by saying, you're not going to college anyway. You're not going to have a successful job anyway. So yeah, you pass. So being mindful of that. So then that self-mediated racism, hey, no one has ever gave me hope where I can envision that I can have a positive life and set myself up for success. No one has ever communicated that to me. When I used to do the risk assessments and the assessments on our youth on probation, one of the major protective factors that can change the trajectory of a child's life to have a positive outcome is the relationships, positive developmental relationships. And oftentimes we saw that was lacking, where a kid will report, no, I don't have any relationships. Or if they weren't involved in sports, they couldn't think of outside their family any positive adult relationship that they had. So that kind of sends them on that path, perhaps because they have internalized that no one has been investing in their future and investing in their life, and going through this path of, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. No one cares for me. I don't have any hope to do anything different.
Yeah, so the lack of hope and the lack of even expectation.
Yes.
Having an expectation that you perform. And you hit it when you said, unless you play sports or you do something that is using a talent, then you're kind of written off. And they don't even want to develop the individual. They just want the talent.
Yes.
And harvesting the talent.
Can I say something? I'm always saying something. I'm sorry,
y'all. Of course, Emma.
But I remember that there was a study done about 15 years ago comparing Fairfax County, richest county in the country, with one of the poorer counties, which is Richmond and Henrico County. And they said, how come these kids aren't, we've been talking about lack of achievement for years and years, lack of achievement, but how come the kids down there were achieving in the school system? And again, this goes back to what Solomon says. And to make it short, they said, because when they come into the schools, and this is part of, we should have those old after school things for kids to do, where they had positive affirmation every day. And I used to say to them when we used to do training, what do you see these children as, these African-American young boys and young girls? And we did a pilot in the school. And I remember going at the end, a lot of our African-American men, I don't know, Solomon, if you were part of that with Calvin, and they would go to, we had 2 schools, and we'd go and they talked to the kids every week. And those kids, those young men loved it. And at the end, we had a big culmination of food and stuff. And I would go in, of course, I had to bum rush and go in there. And the people would talk so hateful to the kids. What you bad boys doing in here? What you bad kids? Yeah, we know. And I thought, oh my goodness. Here we're trying to give them affirmations that you're going to be someone, how we look at you, we're going to positively say you can achieve. Because let me tell you, I worked in New York City. Those kids could count up, excuse me for saying, the drug money and the drugs had changed in their minds. They were very smart. They had lack of accessibility and lack of being taught, but they were smart kids, but no one saw them as that. They saw them as a hustler, a thug, a pimp, what have you. And that's how they treated them. So Solomon, when you're talking about having that positive role model, they need that positive role model. We need schools on Saturday that teaches positive African-American history. Most African-Americans don't know their history. How many people here sitting here tonight knew about the Hidden Figures, the women who were part of the astronauts going to space, into the moon? And some of them live right down the street from us, right down in Virginia. So that positive imagery, we need people who are role models and mentors, and the positive reinforcement. We can overcome a lot of all this stuff we talk about with all these different systems if they also saw themselves in other people's eyes, especially adults, said, y'all will achieve. I had many a social worker I worked with who people, rip the kid, oh, that kid ain't gonna do nothing. He ain't gonna do this, ain't gonna do that. I know the kid who has his master's and has a wonderful job and has done stuff because that social worker never gave up on that child. She stayed with him and hung with him and sent him to Virginia State and got him into grad school and kept moving. And, that's what I'm saying. It's how we perceive and look at it. You don't even have to be culturally sensitive to understand this. You just have to have a positive attitude and affirmation for these children.
Right.
Yes.
And that goes back to some of what's been placed in the chat box, which is starting to fill up. And I just lost the comment that I wanted to go back to. Said they just need one person, they just need one caring adult significantly can alter their future. Someone said, yes, we need, Angela says, we need more STEMs. Sports is the only outlet, but should not be the only one. So there's different things that you've offered up in the context of this conversation about what we can do to improve. And so it gets us to right to 10 minutes before we are about to finish up. So I want to ask each one of you that were on the panel to take about a minute and kind of sum up what's next. Now, we've already dug into what the concerns, the issues are. We looked at some of the resources, but I want us to really leave this conversation with what's next. What should we be doing next to improve the issue or concerns with trust in each one of these areas in the Black community? And Solomon, I'm going to start with you because you waited long enough for everybody else to talk. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to go first.
Well, thank you. Again, I love the conversation, great conversation. So one of the things I'm known for saying, if you want to have real change, you have to have real conversation. So it starts with having these real conversations. So to sum up kind of all that was discussed in the way I took it in is, you know, of course, going back to the Gandhi saying, be the change you wish to see in the world. We have to get involved. We have to get involved. And for me, I think about self-awareness. Everyone on this call, not on this call, need to embrace and take ownership over the influence that we could have over whatever system that we're trying to impact and create change over. So we definitely need to do that, get involved, be present, have those, when you think about accountability, why is this happening? How can we build up trust? It was mentioned on the call. We're asking some of those why questions, right? And I think it's important for us to be courageous. Sometimes and I've been a part of situations where people say, why would you be a part of that? Nothing is never going to change. Well, so it was mentioned, I think by Leon and other folks, that you have to have hope that things can change. Imagine if we all embrace that attitude of, why be a part of that? Nothing is going to change. Why would I go and create a fuss over this? Nothing's going to never. Well, truly, nothing would never change if you just sit on the sofa and never get involved. Never find a way of how can you have influence over whatever you're trying to create some positive impact over. So I think that's important. We need to truly invest in the Black community, showing up, not just talking about it, but actually showing up, being present. Discover ways to get involved. And you say, well, how do we know to get involved? Ask questions, you know, share information, share resources. I think it's important for us to also unify. We need to be on one accord, understand what that shared value is. If we want to uplift the Black community, we all need to be showing up and turning out for all of these events that we're trying to have to continue to uplift the message. Last but not least, but like Ms. Emma said, be very mindful and keen on messaging, because everyone internalize a message or the energy a person is giving off, that we need to be given positive affirmations. We need to be consciously aware of how we're instilling hope, that there is a better way, that there can be a better outcome, that there is a better situation, that we can truly have power and influence over all of our situations, all of the community that we're trying to serve. So,
Okay, you said a lot, and so
yeah,
I appreciate that.
I have some notes here, but I cut it short. So,
Okay, so in 1 minute for each of the last panelists, Ms. Emma, can you give us in 1 minute your takeaways, what we need to be doing next?
Well, I agree with everything Solomon says, and I'm going to agree with the rest of the panelists. Advocate, advocate, advocate. Find allies, find allies. There's a number of folks who taught school, who've been in the system, who've not been in the system. Get together. Let's get together and formulate some kind of curriculum. Let's get together and have those schools on Saturday schools and teach and advocate, advocate, advocate. And again, make sure that we are always positive when we're around our young folk. We don't want to talk about bad kids and that's how they are and this, that, and other thing. And you know where they come from. Let's talk about where they're going to go and all the wonderful things they can become, because they can become president one day. So let's make sure we let them know we know they can, and let's push them on and always be positive for those children.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Ms. Emma. Ms. Leona.
Oh, so many great things said tonight. I put into the chat box, we need to think about fixing the system and not fixing kids. And so wherever you can have the conversation. So if you're in a space where someone is talking about the deficits of kids, how can you bring the conversation back to the system or the adults? Asking those questions to say, okay, so this is the outcome. How did we get here? What's the root cause? Now, that being said, I don't want to let go of what Keyshawn and D'Angelo started talking about with mental health too. We also need to empower our kids to understand and recognize their own feelings. We've been doing more in the schools around that, but people need to be able to articulate, like, I'm frustrated right now. I feel undervalued right now. Kids need to be able to speak on that. So another thing I advocate, I'm urging you all, especially if you're parents or you interact with children, empower them with their voice. Teach them how to use their voice so that they self-advocate. So both of those things. Fix the system, not kids. Empower kids. So any space you can do that, that's great.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Ms. Kishana.
My takeaway would be not to be afraid of change, because we get so comfortable, and when change is always very fearful. And so, and when you're going through different adventures or challenging times with your child, it's always just more comfortable to go, it's okay, that they're just going through something. No, change is very uncomfortable. So not to be afraid of change, because when you know better, you do better. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to round this out with who kicked us off, Mr. D'Angelo.
So definitely agreeing with all the other panelists and what they said. I think they said some great things and the messages. I mean, things that I'm going to continue to preach and say as well. But don't give up. I think Leona, you emphasize how you continue to do this work every single day because you're hopeful that there are some things are going to take place and changes are going to happen. But don't give up. I think definitely as we continue to create these spaces where we can communicate, and talk about these topics and educate one another and educate those outside of our community. I think that's, very important to, really getting people to understand us, understand how we can, be helped or receive help. Another thing is also recognizing our power, recognizing our strength, and recognizing the control that we have. And that kind of goes back to what Solomon mentioned as far as being self-aware. When we're self-aware of that power and, and what we have and what we have to offer, we can then extend that out and help those around us. So I think those are, definitely some of my takeaways, some things I find that's very important.
Wow. So we've had a deep and well put discussion tonight. We've had some great takeaways with having real conversation, continue to create space, do the work, be the change we want to see, recognize our power and control and move forward, advocate. And Saturday school seems to be popular with a lot of folks on here, even in the chat line, but also for us to continue to share our resources and empower our children to use their voice and share their feelings. I love that one the most, is because when we don't shut our children down, they learn to speak up for themselves, and they become more healthy in the mental health and the physical health, and so that they can move forward and be prosperous. We are going to take these, the last thoughts, and put them also into a slide. It will go out with the resources page. So if you want to see what the takeaways were from tonight, you will receive that along with the survey. Please take time to fill out the 5-minute or less survey. We would appreciate that. And those things will come to you in your email, so please be looking for them. Now, we have one more event that is in this series, and that will be on Thursday, November the 19th at 6 p.m. And that conversation will focus on trust and engagement with professionals in the mental health arena, medical services, and law enforcement. That will be the final session in this series. I want to again thank each one of you for spending your evening with us and having this discussion, and all the information that you put into the chat. Man, you guys are awesome. You all rock. I want to say thank you to Fairfax County Government Services, the Neighborhood and Community Services, Health Department, Department of Family Services, and the Fairfax Falls Church Community Services Board, in partnership with Fairfax County Public Schools and the Northern Virginia chapter of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, for putting this on. The collaboration has been great, and we are looking forward to our next series, and hopefully you will be there. You will have the opportunity to sign up with the link that you will receive. And with that, we say good night.